A common requirement in many applications is entry of a date, such as a hire date or due date or effective date. The problem with dates is that there are many valid date formats. Using a date picker control can make it easier to accept entry of multiple date formats, or the user can simply pick a date using the drop-down calendar. The date picker is available as part of UI Bootstrap. UI Bootstrap provides a set of Bootstrap components that are written in AngularJS and are available for use in your application. Here we are on the UI Bootstrap site. If you look under Directives, you'll see all of the different components provided here. We are only going to use the date picker at this point. If you have a chance, check out some of these other cool components. You can find the documentation for the date picker here. We again have similar steps for setting up this new date picker component. Start by locating and downloading the required JavaScript file. You can find the date picker-popup as part of UI Bootstrap at this URL. Add this JavaScript file to the JS directory of the project. Add a reference to this new .js file in index.html. Add a module dependency on UI Bootstrap, and add the date picker pop-up directive to the desired input control. In this example, we are adding a product availability date using the same layout and styling pattern we used previously. The availability date is the date that the product is available in inventory. The date picker pop-up directive is defined in the input tag. Set the directive value to the default format for display of the date. In this example, we're defining the month abbreviation, day, and year, but you can define any valid date format. The span tag adds a button with a calendar icon. The user can click this button to open or close the date picker. You can add a date picker anywhere you need to request entry of a date. Let's add this date to our sample application. Once again, we are back in WebStorm. I have already downloaded the UI Bootstrap component and added it in the JS folder. We then need to add a reference to this JS file in index.html. I'll put it here. And we need to add a dependency on UI Bootstrap to app.js. So we'll put that here. Now we'll go to our form. The first thing that we want to do is move the HTML elements for the product code. Recall that the description is a wide field. The form will look better if the wide description field is at the bottom of the form. So we're going to move this above the description field. We'll also add the availability date label and control above this description. And we'll paste in the code from the slides. Here we added a form group following the pattern we have used previously. We defined a label and an input box. We set the type of input box to text, not a date. That way the browser won't attempt to handle the date, and we'll let the date picker handle it instead. We set the date picker pop-up directive to the date format we want to display in the control. Any valid date format will work here. We set the ngModel directive to the product's release date, which is defined in the JSON as a string. The ngModel directive sets up the two-way binding. The button tag defines a button with a calendar icon. The user can click this button to drop down a calendar and pick a date. Let's see this code in action. We'll select Product List and edit the hammer. And we can see that the date is displayed. We can modify this date. But the date picker doesn't open. That's because we don't have any code set up for the button's click event. Let's do that now. Let's look back at app.js. Here again are our states. Notice that we don't currently have a controller defined for the productEdit.info state, so we don't currently have a place to put any code for the button. So we have a decision to make. Should we add the required code for the datepicker button to the parent controller, or build a controller for this child page? For this sample, we'll add the required code to the parent controller. But in a real application, you may want to add a separate controller for each state. That keeps the code encapsulated. Let's define an open method in the parent controller. So we're going to go to Product Edit Controller, and we're going to define an open method in the parent controller. I'll paste that code in, and then we can talk through it. So here's the open method. This function takes $event as a parameter. $event represents the original event object, and we'll need to pass that in. Within the function, we first call prevent default on the event to prevent any default action from being triggered. We only want our action that we're defining within this function to be executed. Then we'll call stop propagation on the event to prevent the event from being propagated. Lastly, we'll add a variable onto the model. The variable is opened. When the button is clicked, this code reverses the value of the variable. So if the calendar is closed, this code will define that it should be opened. And if it's open, the click will define that it should be closed. So the next thing we need to do is add the ngClick directive onto the button, passing in the event. We do that in Product Info view. Here's the calendar button. We need to add the ngClick directive. We want to assign this directive to the appropriate method in the controller. When the user clicks on the button, we want to call the open method and pass in the current event, which is defined with $event. So we're going to call vm.open and pass in $event. Recall that we defined a variable called opened on the model. The opened variable tracks whether or not the calendar is open. We can bind the isOpen attribute of the datepicker to that model variable we defined. So let's do that. Here we'll add an isOpen, and we're going to bind that to our opened variable. Now let's try the datepicker again. Go to Product List, select to edit the hammer, and you can see our data is displayed. We can click the calendar button, and the calendar pops down. We can then pick a different value from the pop-up. If we don't want to change the date, we can simply click the button again, and the pop-up closes. Cool! We now have a user-friendly date picker. But we are still missing one key feature here on our form, the save feature. Let's do that next.